Marcus Holloway thought he had found his salvation when he bought the abandoned pawn shop on the corner of 5th and Maple. The building had been sitting empty for 3 years, its windows boarded up with plywood that had weathered to a dull gray, weeds pushed through cracks in the sidewalk, and graffiti tagged the brick walls like urban scars. But Marcus saw potential where others saw decay. He saw a chance to start over, to build something honest with his own hands after years of carrying other people's wars on his shoulders. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Marcus first walked through the front door of Holloway's Pawn and Loan, sunlight struggled to penetrate the grimy windows, casting strange shadows across the empty display cases. Dust motes danced in the pale beams, and the air held the musty smell of neglect mixed with something else he couldn't quite identify. His boots echoed on the scuffed linoleum as he surveyed what would become his new life. Behind him, a low whine drew his attention. Tank, his 3-year-old Belgian Malinois, stood rigid in the doorway, his pointed ears swiveling as he assessed this unfamiliar territory. Marcus had found Tank at a veterans rehabilitation center 2 years earlier. The dog had been returned by 3 different families, labeled as too intense, too protective, too much for civilian life. Marcus understood that feeling. Some soldiers, whether human or canine, carried the war long after the fighting stopped. Tank was lean and muscular, his tan and black coat bearing a small scar above his left eye from his military service days. His amber eyes held an intelligence that bordered on unsettling, and his loyalty to Marcus was absolute and unwavering. The pawn shop had been owned by an elderly man named Harold Brennan, who had run the business for 47 years before his sudden death from a heart attack. His estate had been eager to sell quickly and cheaply, and Marcus had used nearly every penny of his military savings and disability compensation to make the purchase. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, a narrow 2-story brick building squeezed between a laundromat and a Mexican restaurant, but it had good bones and a location that still saw foot traffic despite the neighborhood's slow decline. Marcus was 34 years old, though the lines around his green eyes and the premature silver threading through his dark brown hair made him look older. He was of medium height, but built with the wiry strength that came from years of military discipline. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left him with a slight limp in his left leg, courtesy of an improvised explosive device that had claimed 2 of his squad mates and nearly taken his own life. The physical scars were nothing compared to the invisible wounds that kept him awake at night, replaying moments when split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. He had tried the corporate world after his discharge, accepting a security position at a downtown office complex. The fluorescent lights, the endless meetings, the petty office politics had felt like a different kind of prison. He lasted 8 months before the panic attacks started. The feeling of being trapped in that sterile environment, surrounded by people who had never seen real danger, who complained about minor inconveniences while he carried memories of friends who would never come home, had nearly broken him. Tank had been his lifeline during those dark months, a warm presence during the nightmares, and a silent companion who understood without judgment. The decision to buy the pawn shop had come to him during one of his long walks through the older parts of town. He had always been good with his hands, could fix almost anything mechanical, and had an eye for determining the value of items others might overlook. A pawn shop would let him work alone, set his own hours, and deal with people on his own terms. It would be a place where broken things could be repaired, where people could get second chances, where someone like him could build something meaningful from the ground up. The main floor of the shop was larger than it appeared from the street, with glass display cases running along 3 walls and a heavy wooden counter positioned near the back. Behind the counter, a doorway led to a small office and storage area. A narrow staircase in the rear corner provided access to what had been Harold Brennan's apartment on the 2nd floor, a cramped but functional living space that Marcus planned to renovate as his own home. The basement, according to the real estate agent, was primarily used for storage and contained the building's utilities. Marcus spent the first week cleaning decades of accumulated dust and grime from every surface. Tank proved to be an enthusiastic helper, using his keen nose to investigate every corner and crevice. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense things that weren't quite right, a skill that had served them both well during their military service. As Marcus scrubbed and organized, he began to develop a mental inventory of what Harold Brennan had left behind. The previous owner had apparently been something of a pack rat. The storage room was filled with boxes of miscellaneous items that hadn't been valuable enough to display, but too potentially useful to discard. Marcus found boxes of old jewelry that might clean up nicely, vintage tools that collectors would appreciate, and stacks of books and records from decades past. Each discovery felt like a small treasure hunt, and he began to understand why Harold had stayed in this business for nearly half a century. It was during his second week that Marcus first noticed Tank's unusual behavior around the basement door. The dog would approach the heavy wooden door, then stop abruptly, his body tensing as if he sensed something troubling below. His ears would flatten against his head, and a low growl would rumble deep in his chest. Marcus had initially attributed this to the unfamiliar smells and sounds of the old building, but Tank's reaction seemed specifically focused on that one location. The basement itself appeared unremarkable when Marcus finally ventured down to check the furnace and electrical systems. It was a typical urban basement, with a concrete floor and exposed brick walls that wept moisture during humid weather. Cardboard boxes lined metal shelving units, and the mechanical systems hummed quietly in one corner. Everything seemed normal, but Tank refused to descend the stairs, no matter how much Marcus encouraged him. As the days passed, Marcus fell into a routine that felt more natural than anything he had experienced since his discharge from the military. He would wake before dawn, take Tank for a run through the quiet streets, then spend the morning organizing inventory and researching the value of items he planned to sell. Afternoons were devoted to repairs and restoration work, tasks that engaged both his hands and his mind in satisfying ways. The repetitive nature of cleaning tarnished silver or adjusting the mechanism of an old watch provided a meditative quality that helped quiet the restless voices in his head. His first customers were neighborhood regulars who had done business with Harold for years. An elderly woman named Mrs. Rodriguez brought in a box of costume jewelry that had belonged to her late sister, hoping to get enough money for her granddaughter's school supplies. A young father pawned his wedding ring to cover rent, promising to return within the month to reclaim it. Each transaction taught Marcus something about the delicate balance between business necessity and human compassion that successful pawn shop owners had to master. Marcus quickly learned that his customers were often dealing with temporary setbacks rather than permanent poverty. The construction worker who pawned his tools during a slow period would return to reclaim them when a new job started. The single mother who sold her grandmother's china would sometimes come back months later with enough money to buy it back. These people weren't looking for charity, they were looking for options, and Marcus found meaning in providing those options with dignity and fair dealing. Tank proved to be an excellent judge of character, remaining calm and approachable with honest customers while growing alert and protective when someone entered the shop with questionable intentions. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense when someone was casing the place for a potential robbery or trying to sell stolen goods. His presence alone was often enough to discourage anyone with criminal intentions from following through on their plans. 3 weeks into his new venture, Marcus received an unexpected visit from Detective Sarah Chen, a compact woman in her early 40s, with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She arrived on a Tuesday morning, introducing herself with a firm handshake and a business card that identified her as a 15-year veteran of the city's police force. Detective Chen explained that she was conducting a routine follow-up investigation related to Harold Brennan's death.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
While the coroner had ruled the death a natural heart attack, there had been some irregularities in the old man's financial records that warranted a closer look. She was particularly interested in whether Marcus had discovered any unusual items or documents during his cleanup of the shop. Marcus told her about the boxes of miscellaneous inventory he was still sorting through, but mentioned nothing specifically unusual. Detective Chen seemed satisfied with his answers and left her contact information, asking him to call if he discovered anything that seemed out of place. She also mentioned that Harold had been known to keep detailed records of his transactions and that those records might be valuable if they ever surfaced. That evening, as Marcus was closing up the shop, he noticed Tank standing at the top of the basement stairs, staring down into the darkness with unusual intensity. The dog's body was rigid, his ears pricked forward, and he was making a soft whining sound that Marcus had never heard before. It wasn't the alert bark Tank used when strangers approached the shop, nor the protective growl he employed when he sensed potential threats. This was something different, something that spoke of curiosity mixed with caution. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and descended the basement stairs, calling for Tank to follow. The dog remained at the top, pacing nervously back and forth but refusing to join him below. The basement appeared exactly as it had during his previous visits, but Marcus found himself looking more carefully at details he might have previously overlooked. The arrangement of storage boxes seemed oddly systematic, as if they had been positioned to create specific pathways through the space. Several boxes showed signs of having been moved recently, despite the thick layer of dust that covered most surfaces. In the far corner of the basement, behind a stack of boxes that contained old Christmas decorations and seasonal merchandise, Marcus discovered something he had missed during his initial survey. Set into the concrete floor was what appeared to be an old-fashioned floor safe, the kind that had been popular in commercial buildings during the early 20th century. The safe was partially concealed by years of accumulated debris and appeared to have been deliberately hidden beneath layers of cardboard and old newspapers. The safe itself was a substantial piece of equipment, constructed of heavy steel with an ornate combination dial and handle. Rust had claimed portions of the exterior, but the mechanism appeared to be intact. There was no visible manufacturer's marking or serial number that might provide clues about its age or origin. What struck Marcus as unusual was that someone had clearly taken care to conceal its existence, going so far as to position storage boxes in ways that would discourage casual discovery. Marcus spent nearly an hour examining the safe and its surroundings, trying to determine whether it had been installed by Harold Brennan or by some previous owner of the building. The concrete around the safe showed signs of having been patched and repaired multiple times over the years, suggesting that the installation was quite old. Several electrical conduits had been routed around the safe's location in ways that indicated its presence had been a known factor in the building's construction and renovation history. When Marcus finally returned to the main floor, he found Tank waiting anxiously at the top of the basement stairs. The dog immediately began sniffing at Marcus's clothes and hands, as if trying to determine what he had encountered in the basement. Tank's behavior suggested that he was aware of the safe's presence, even though he had never descended the stairs to see it directly. The dog's acute senses might have detected unusual sounds, smells, or even vibrations that had escaped human notice. That night, as Marcus lay in his sleeping bag on the floor of what would eventually become his bedroom, he found his mind returning repeatedly to the hidden safe. The discovery raised obvious questions about what it might contain and why Harold Brennan had never mentioned its existence. According to the real estate agent, the sale had included all fixtures and contents of the building, which would presumably include any safes or security devices. The fact that it had been deliberately concealed suggested either that Harold had forgotten about it over the years or that he had intentionally chosen not to disclose its presence. The following morning brought a visit from an elderly man named Frank Gutierrez, who identified himself as Harold Brennan's former business partner from decades earlier. Frank was in his late 70s, walking with a carved wooden cane and wearing a well-maintained but obviously vintage suit. His eyes were sharp and alert, and he carried himself with the dignity of someone who had lived through significant experiences and emerged with his integrity intact. Frank explained that he and Harold had operated the pawn shop together during the 1980s and early 1990s before personal differences led to Frank selling his share of the business and pursuing other opportunities.
He had heard about Marcus's purchase of the shop through neighborhood connections and wanted to offer his congratulations and assistance. Frank possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the shop's history and clientele, and his stories provided Marcus with valuable insights into the business's past operations. During their conversation, Frank mentioned that Harold had always been obsessively secretive about certain aspects of the business, particularly regarding high-value items and long-term storage arrangements. Harold had insisted on maintaining a separate set of records for what he called special circumstances, transactions that required discretion and confidentiality beyond the normal requirements of pawnshop operations. Frank had never been entirely comfortable with these arrangements, and they had contributed to the eventual dissolution of their partnership. When Marcus casually mentioned his discovery of the basement safe, Frank's demeanor immediately changed. The older man's face grew pale, and his hands began to tremble slightly as he gripped his cane. Frank admitted that he had wondered for years what had become of that particular safe, and that its contents had been a source of considerable anxiety for him. He urged Marcus to be extremely careful about attempting to open it, suggesting that some secrets were better left buried. Frank's reaction was so dramatic that Marcus pressed him for additional details. After considerable hesitation, Frank revealed that the safe had been installed during the early 1980s as part of Harold's involvement in what he euphemistically called special services for select clientele. These services had involved storing items for people who needed secure, discreet, long-term safekeeping without the formal documentation requirements of traditional safety deposit boxes. Harold had charged substantial fees for these services, and the clients had typically been individuals who operated on the margins of legitimate society. The nature of these clients and their stored items had made Frank increasingly uncomfortable over the years. While Harold insisted that their activities were legal, Frank suspected that many of the items being stored had been obtained through questionable means. The clients included people involved in various forms of organized crime, corrupt officials seeking to hide evidence of their activities, and individuals who had acquired valuable items through inheritance disputes or insurance fraud. Frank had eventually demanded that Harold dissolve these relationships and return all stored items to their owners, but Harold had refused, arguing that the income was too substantial to abandon. Frank's revelations cast Harold Brennan's sudden death in a potentially different light. If the safe contained items belonging to dangerous individuals, those people might eventually come looking for their property. Frank warned Marcus that opening the safe without understanding its contents could expose him to serious risks, both legal and personal. He strongly advised Marcus to contact the police immediately and let them handle the situation through official channels. Marcus thanked Frank for his candor, but stopped short of making any commitments about his next steps. After Frank left, Marcus found himself wrestling with competing impulses. His military training had taught him to assess risks carefully and seek appropriate support when facing potentially dangerous situations. At the same time, his natural curiosity and desire for independence made him reluctant to involve outside authorities before he had a better understanding of what he was dealing with. Tank seemed to sense his master's internal conflict and remained closer than usual throughout the day, occasionally resting his head against Marcus's leg in a gesture of silent support. The dog's presence was comforting, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at a crossroads that would determine not just the future of his business, but potentially the direction of his entire life. As evening approached, Marcus made a decision that would prove to have far-reaching consequences. Rather than immediately contacting Detective Chen or attempting to open the safe himself, he decided to conduct additional research into Harold Brennan's background and the history of the building. He spent the night searching online databases and newspaper archives, looking for any information that might provide context for Frank's warnings. What he discovered painted a more complex picture of Harold Brennan than the simple small business owner described by the real estate agent. During the 1980s and 1990s, Harold's name had appeared peripherally in several newspaper articles about police investigations into organized crime activities in the city. While Harold had never been charged with any crimes, his pawnshop had apparently been used by several individuals who were later convicted of various illegal enterprises. The articles suggested that Harold had provided financial services and secure storage for people who preferred to avoid traditional banking relationships. More disturbing was Marcus's discovery that Harold's death had not been entirely unexpected by those who knew him well. Several online obituaries and social media posts referenced Harold's increasing paranoia and anxiety during his final months.
Friends described him as constantly looking over his shoulder, checking locks multiple times, and expressing concerns about people from his past who might be seeking to settle old scores. Harold had apparently told several people that he had been receiving threatening phone calls and had noticed strangers watching his building. These revelations suggested that Harold's heart attack might have been stress-induced, brought on by fears related to his past activities.
If Harold had been storing items for dangerous individuals, and if those individuals believed he had betrayed their trust or stolen their property, they might have been applying pressure that contributed to his death. This possibility meant that Marcus might have unknowingly inherited not just a business and a building, but also a set of enemies who were unaware that Harold was no longer alive. The weight of these discoveries kept Marcus awake for most of the night. Tank lay beside him, occasionally lifting his head to check on his master's restless movements. As dawn broke over the city, casting long shadows through the shop's windows, Marcus realized that his quiet plan to build a simple, honest life had become significantly more complicated. The safe in his basement wasn't just a curiosity or a potential source of valuable inventory. It was a Pandora's box that might contain evidence of crimes, stolen goods, or information that dangerous people would kill to protect or recover. Despite these concerns, Marcus found himself drawn repeatedly to the basement throughout the following day. Tank continued to refuse to accompany him downstairs, but his behavior had evolved from nervous avoidance to protective vigilance. The dog now positioned himself at the top of the basement stairs whenever Marcus went below, maintaining a watchful guard that suggested he understood the potential significance of what lay hidden in the safe. Marcus's examination of the safe itself revealed additional details that had escaped his initial notice. The combination dial showed signs of recent use, with wear patterns that suggested it had been opened within the past few years. Several small scratches around the dial and handle appeared to be fresh, indicating that Harold had accessed the safe's contents shortly before his death. These observations supported Frank's suggestion that the safe was not simply a forgotten relic, but an active storage device that had played an ongoing role in Harold's business operations. The safe's construction and design suggested that it had been manufactured during the 1970s or early 1980s, making it a relatively modern installation rather than an original feature of the building. The concrete surrounding the safe showed evidence of professional installation, with reinforcement bars and specialized anchoring systems that would have required significant expense and expertise. This level of investment suggested that the safe had been intended to protect items of considerable value, whether monetary or otherwise. As Marcus continued his research into the building's history, he discovered that the structure had housed various commercial enterprises over the decades. Prior to Harold's pawn shop, the building had been home to a small accounting firm, a used furniture store, and even briefly a private lending operation that had been shut down by state regulators for questionable practices. This history of businesses that dealt with valuable items and financial transactions provided context for why someone might have installed a hidden safe in the basement. Marcus also learned that the neighborhood itself had a complex past that included periods of economic decline, urban renewal efforts, and ongoing struggles with various forms of criminal activity. During the 1980s and 1990s, the area had been known as a place where people could conduct business without excessive scrutiny from law enforcement or regulatory agencies. While the neighborhood had improved significantly in recent years, it still retained connections to its more colorful past. These historical patterns suggested that Harold's involvement in questionable activities was not an aberration, but part of a larger ecosystem of businesses and individuals who operated in the gray areas between legal and illegal commerce. The safe might contain items related not just to Harold's individual activities, but to a network of relationships and transactions that spanned decades. Opening it could potentially expose Marcus to complications involving multiple parties and jurisdictions. The arrival of another unexpected visitor on Friday afternoon added a new dimension to Marcus's growing dilemma. The man who entered the shop introduced himself simply as Vincent, claiming to be a longtime customer of Harold's who had been traveling when the old man died. Vincent was impeccably dressed in an expensive charcoal suit and handmade leather shoes, but there was something about his manner that set Marcus immediately on edge. Tank's reaction was even more pronounced, the dog rising to his feet and positioning himself between Marcus and the visitor while maintaining the kind of alert posture that suggested imminent action. Vincent explained that Harold had been storing several valuable items for him and that he had come to reclaim his property. He produced what appeared to be a legitimate receipt bearing Harold's signature and dated just 2 months before the old man's death. The receipt described the items in vague terms, referring to them as collectibles and family heirlooms that required secure storage while Vincent was traveling internationally. Vincent offered to pay any outstanding storage fees and requested immediate access to his items. Marcus explained that he was still cataloging the shop's inventory and hadn't yet located all of Harold's storage records. He asked Vincent to return in a few days, promising to conduct a thorough search for the items described on the receipt. Vincent's response was polite, but contained an undertone that Marcus recognized from his military experience. It was the kind of controlled menace that professional predators used when they wanted to communicate threat without making explicit statements. After Vincent left, Marcus immediately called Detective Chen and described the visit. Chen's questions revealed that she was already familiar with Vincent, though she was careful not to provide specific details about his background or activities. She advised Marcus to avoid any further contact with Vincent and to notify her immediately if he returned to the shop. Chen also mentioned that she would be increasing patrol frequency in the neighborhood and suggested that Marcus consider upgrading his security systems. The detective's reaction confirmed Marcus's suspicions that Vincent was not simply a legitimate customer seeking to recover stored property. The man's appearance, demeanor, and the police's obvious interest in his activities suggested connections to criminal enterprises that went far beyond simple pawn shop transactions. Marcus realized that Harold's death might have created a power vacuum or information gap that was drawing dangerous individuals out of hiding as they sought to protect or recover their interests. That evening, as Marcus was preparing to close the shop, Tank's behavior reached a new level of intensity. The dog began pacing restlessly throughout the building, pausing frequently to stare at the basement door while emitting low whines that seemed to convey urgent concern. His agitation was so pronounced that Marcus began to wonder whether Tank was sensing something specific that human senses couldn't detect. The dog's military training had included detection work, and his instincts had proven reliable in numerous dangerous situations. Marcus decided to trust his companion's judgment and conducted another thorough examination of the basement, this time focusing on areas he might have previously overlooked. Using a powerful flashlight and moving slowly through the space, he searched for any signs of recent disturbance or hidden features that might explain Tank's persistent anxiety. His methodical search revealed several details that had escaped his earlier notice. The storage boxes positioned around the safe showed subtle signs of having been moved and replaced recently. Dust patterns on the floor indicated that someone had cleared pathways to the safe within the past few months, and several boxes contained items that seemed inconsistent with a pawn shop's typical inventory. Rather than the mixture of personal effects and small merchandise he had found elsewhere, these boxes contained primarily documentation, including file folders, ledger books, and what appeared to be photographic materials stored in protective envelopes. Marcus's examination of these materials revealed that Harold had indeed maintained extensive records of his special storage services, just as Frank had suggested. The files contained detailed inventories of items stored for various clients, along with photographs that documented their condition and identifying characteristics. Many of the items appeared to be valuable antiques, jewelry, and artwork that would have commanded significant prices in legitimate markets. However, the documentation also suggested that the provenance of many items was questionable or deliberately obscured. More troubling were the files that appeared to document Harold's relationships with his clients. These records included not just basic contact information, but detailed notes about the client's backgrounds, associates, and business activities. Harold had apparently maintained these files as a form of insurance, creating a comprehensive archive of information that could be used to protect himself or to leverage his clients if circumstances required. The files suggested that Harold had been far more than a simple service provider, functioning instead as a key participant in a network of individuals involved in various illegal enterprises. Among the most significant discoveries were files related to several high-profile crimes that had occurred in the city during the past 2 decades. Harold's records suggested that he had provided storage and laundering services for proceeds from bank robberies, art thefts, and insurance fraud schemes. The documentation was sufficiently detailed to potentially serve as evidence in criminal prosecutions, assuming that law enforcement could authenticate the materials and establish their chain of custody. Marcus realized that he had stumbled into a situation far more complex and dangerous than he had initially imagined. The safe undoubtedly contained the most valuable and incriminating items in Harold's collection, materials that could destroy the lives and freedom of numerous individuals if they were discovered by law enforcement. At the same time, those same materials represented potential threats to anyone who possessed them, as the people involved would likely go to extraordinary lengths to prevent their exposure. The documentation also revealed why Harold had become increasingly paranoid during his final months. Several clients had been pressuring him to return their stored items, apparently because they suspected that law enforcement was closing in on their activities. Harold had been caught between his desire to maintain his profitable services and his fear that cooperating with his client's demands would expose him to criminal charges or violent retaliation from competing interests. As Marcus absorbed the implications of his discoveries, Tank's behavior suddenly changed. The dog stopped his restless pacing and moved to a position near the basement stairs, his body rigid and his ears pricked forward in an alert posture that indicated he had detected something specific. His attention seemed focused on sounds or movements that were beyond Marcus's ability to perceive, but the dog's reaction was unmistakable. Someone or something was approaching the building, and Tank was preparing to respond to a potential threat. Marcus quietly moved to a window that provided a view of the street outside, taking care to avoid silhouetting himself against any interior lights. What he saw confirmed his worst fears and set in motion a series of events that would force him to confront the full consequences of his decision to purchase Harold Brennan's troubled legacy. 3 black sedans had pulled up across the street from the pawn shop, their engines running and their occupants remaining inside the vehicles. The cars were positioned strategically to block potential escape routes, and their tinted windows made it impossible to determine how many people they contained or what their intentions might be. Marcus recognized the tactical positioning from his military experience, the kind of coordinated approach that suggested professional training and serious intent. Tank's growl deepened to a rumble that Marcus could feel vibrating through the floorboards. The dog's hackles were raised along his spine, and his amber eyes remained fixed on the basement door even though the immediate threat appeared to be outside the building. Marcus realized that Tank might be detecting sounds or vibrations that indicated someone was attempting to access the basement from another direction, perhaps through utility tunnels or adjacent building connections that weren't visible from street level. Moving carefully to avoid being seen from outside, Marcus made his way to the rear of the building to check the back entrance. The alley behind the shop was narrow and poorly lit, lined with dumpsters and loading docks that served the various businesses on the block. What he saw there confirmed his worst suspicions. 2 additional vehicles had positioned themselves to cover the rear exit, and several figures in dark clothing were moving through the shadows with the disciplined coordination of a professional team. Marcus retreated to the main floor and quickly assessed his options. The building's landline phone had been disconnected during the transition of ownership, and his cell phone was getting only intermittent signal strength due to the building's thick brick walls and basement location. Calling for police assistance would require either moving to a location with better reception or finding an alternative means of communication. Both options would require leaving the building or exposing himself to observation from the surveillance teams outside. The tactical situation was clearly designed to force him into a disadvantageous position. The people outside wanted him to either surrender voluntarily or attempt an escape that would allow them to apprehend him away from the building. Either scenario would give them access to the shop and its contents without having to deal with potential witnesses or complications from law enforcement intervention. Marcus realized that his military training was about to be put to a test he had hoped never to face again in civilian life. Tank's behavior had evolved from protective alertness to active preparation for combat. The dog had positioned himself near the front door but was maintaining visual contact with both the basement stairs and Marcus's location. His breathing had become controlled and focused, the kind of respiratory pattern that indicated he was preparing for sustained physical exertion. Marcus had seen this transformation before in theater, when Tank had detected enemy combatants approaching their position and had prepared to engage multiple targets simultaneously. The sound of footsteps on the building's roof confirmed that the surveillance had evolved into an active breach attempt. Marcus could hear multiple sets of boots moving across the old shingles with practiced stealth, but not quite silently enough to escape detection by someone trained to recognize such sounds. The team outside was implementing a coordinated entry plan that would allow them to access the building from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming any resistance through superior numbers and tactical positioning. Marcus made a rapid decision that drew on both his military experience and his growing understanding of Harold Brennan's security preparations. Rather than attempting to defend the main floor or escape through conventional routes, he would retreat to the basement and use the confined space to negate the attacker's numerical advantage. The basement's narrow stairs and limited access points would force any assault team to approach in single file, allowing him and Tank to engage them one at a time rather than facing coordinated group tactics. Moving quickly but quietly, Marcus gathered several items that might prove useful in a prolonged confrontation. Harold's desk contained a heavy-duty flashlight and what appeared to be a modified police scanner that could monitor multiple emergency frequencies simultaneously. A storage closet yielded a crowbar that could serve as both a tool and a weapon, along with several lengths of chain that Harold had apparently used for securing valuable merchandise during transport. Tank preceded him down the basement stairs, the dog's senses providing early warning of any threats that might be waiting in the confined space below. The basement felt different now, charged with tension and the anticipation of violence. The hidden safe seemed to radiate significance, a silent reminder of the valuable secrets that had attracted this dangerous attention. Marcus realized that opening the safe might be his only option for understanding what he was truly facing and why these people were willing to risk such an aggressive operation to obtain its contents. The basement's layout provided several defensive advantages that Marcus hadn't previously considered. The heavy support pillars created natural cover positions that could protect him from gunfire while allowing him to observe multiple approach routes. The electrical and plumbing systems created obstacles that would slow down attackers and provide opportunities for ambush tactics. Most importantly, the basement's single exit point meant that he could predict exactly where any assault would originate and prepare accordingly. Marcus positioned himself behind a concrete support pillar that provided a clear view of the staircase while keeping him concealed from direct observation. Tank took up a position on the opposite side of the basement, creating a crossfire situation that would allow them to attack any intruders from multiple angles. The dog's military training included coordinated tactics that had been developed specifically for urban combat situations, and Marcus trusted Tank's ability to execute complex maneuvers without explicit verbal commands. The sounds from above indicated that the intruders had successfully gained access to the main floor and were conducting a systematic search of the building. Marcus could hear furniture being moved and drawers being opened as the team worked through each room methodically. Their approach suggested that they were looking for something specific rather than conducting a general robbery, confirming his suspicion that the safe and its contents were their primary objective. Several minutes passed before the search team discovered the basement stairs. Marcus could hear voices discussing their approach in low, professional tones that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. The accent patterns indicated that at least some of the team members were not native English speakers, possibly suggesting international connections that aligned with Harold's documented relationships with various criminal enterprises. When the first intruder began descending the stairs, Tank remained perfectly motionless until the man had committed fully to the descent. The dog's attack was swift and precisely targeted, designed to disable rather than kill. Tank's military training emphasized controlled aggression that would neutralize threats while minimizing unnecessary casualties. The intruder's surprised cry and the sound of his weapon clattering across the concrete floor indicated that Tank's assault had been successful. Marcus used the confusion created by Tank's attack to advance on the staircase and secure the dropped weapon, a military-grade assault rifle that confirmed these were not ordinary criminals but professionals with access to serious firepower. The tactical situation had suddenly shifted in his favor, but he knew that the advantage would be temporary. The team outside would adapt their approach and potentially escalate their methods in response to the initial setback. The injured intruder was conscious but effectively neutralized by a damaged shoulder that prevented him from using his arms effectively. Marcus used the chains from Harold's storage closet to secure the man to one of the basement's support pillars, ensuring that he couldn't interfere with the ongoing confrontation or provide intelligence to his associates outside. The man's equipment and identification documents might provide valuable information about the organization behind this assault. Tank had returned to his defensive position and was monitoring the staircase for additional threats. The dog showed no signs of injury from his initial engagement, and his continued alertness suggested that he was prepared for sustained combat operations. Marcus realized that their military partnership was proving as effective in civilian circumstances as it had been in overseas deployments, even though the context and stakes were entirely different. The assault team's response to their casualty was swift and professional. Rather than immediately sending additional personnel down the stairs, they began implementing what sounded like a siege strategy designed to force Marcus and Tank to surrender through attrition rather than direct confrontation.
The sounds from above indicated that they were setting up equipment that might include surveillance devices, communication jammers, or even more aggressive options like tear gas or flashbang grenades. Marcus realized that time was working against him and that his defensive position, while temporarily secure, would become untenable if the attackers were willing to escalate their methods. The basement's confined space that provided tactical advantages would become a death trap if the intruders decided to use chemical agents or explosive devices.
He needed to either neutralize the threat quickly or find an alternative escape route that didn't involve direct confrontation with superior numbers. His examination of the captured intruder's equipment revealed sophisticated communications gear that was still active and receiving transmissions from the assault team's coordination center. Marcus could hear fragments of conversation that indicated the team was receiving instructions from a remote command authority, possibly someone monitoring the operation from a separate location. The professional nature of their communications suggested that this was not a simple criminal enterprise but a well-organized operation with significant resources and planning behind it. The intruder himself appeared to be Eastern European, possibly Russian or Ukrainian based on his accent and the Cyrillic text visible on some of his equipment. His tactical gear was military surplus but had been modified with aftermarket components that suggested extensive combat experience. Most troubling was the discovery of what appeared to be official identification documents from a private security contractor that operated internationally, indicating that these might not be criminals at all but legitimate mercenaries hired to recover specific assets. This revelation forced Marcus to reconsider his entire understanding of the situation. If Harold had been storing items belonging to foreign nationals or international criminal organizations, the response to his death might involve diplomatic or intelligence complications that went far beyond local law enforcement jurisdiction. The safe in his basement might contain evidence or materials related to activities that had national security implications, transforming his situation from a local criminal matter into something far more complex and dangerous. Tank's sudden alertness to sounds coming from a different direction indicated that the assault team had discovered an alternative access route to the basement. The building's age and construction meant that it shared utility connections with adjacent structures, and the attackers had apparently located a way to approach from an unexpected direction. Marcus realized that his defensive position was about to be compromised and that he needed to take immediate action to prevent being surrounded. The sound of drilling or cutting equipment suggested that the team was creating a new access point rather than using existing connections. Their willingness to modify the building's structure indicated both significant resources and a determination that suggested the value of their objective far exceeded the costs of their operation. Marcus began to understand that Harold's safe might contain items worth millions of dollars or information that could destroy powerful individuals or organizations. Rather than waiting for the assault team to complete their preparations, Marcus decided to take the initiative and attempt to open the safe before they could prevent him from accessing its contents. If the safe contained evidence of criminal activities, that information might provide him with leverage to negotiate his way out of the current situation. Alternatively, if the safe contained valuables or documents that belonged to his attackers, surrendering those items might allow him to resolve the confrontation without further violence. The safe combination mechanism was more complex than Marcus had initially realized, featuring multiple dials and what appeared to be additional security features that would prevent unauthorized access even if the primary combination were somehow discovered. Harold had apparently invested in a sophisticated system that would require either extensive technical knowledge or specialized equipment to bypass. The time required to open the safe through trial and error would almost certainly exceed the time available before the assault team completed their alternative access route. Marcus's examination of Harold's captured files revealed that the old man had maintained detailed records of the safe's combination but had encoded that information in a way that would prevent casual discovery. The combination appeared to be hidden within what looked like routine business records, possibly using a substitution cipher or numerical code that would require careful analysis to decode. The complexity of Harold's security measures indicated that he had anticipated exactly this kind of situation and had prepared accordingly. Tank's growling had intensified to indicate that the alternative access point was nearing completion. The dog's positioning suggested that the new threat would emerge from the far corner of the basement, behind a stack of storage boxes that had previously seemed unremarkable. Marcus realized that Harold's arrangement of the basement storage had been deliberately planned to provide defensive advantages, with the boxes positioned to create cover and concealment for anyone protecting the safe. The sound of the cutting equipment stopped abruptly, replaced by voices coordinating the final phase of the assault. Marcus could hear at least 3 different individuals preparing to breach the basement from the new access point, while additional personnel remained positioned to prevent escape through the main staircase. The tactical coordination suggested that these were experienced professionals who had conducted similar operations multiple times and were prepared for various contingencies. Marcus made the critical decision to focus his efforts on decoding Harold's combination records rather than attempting to hold a defensive position that was rapidly becoming untenable. If he could open the safe and understand its contents, he might be able to negotiate with his attackers, or at least understand what he was truly dealing with. The alternative was to engage in a firefight with superior numbers in a confined space, an outcome that would likely result in his death regardless of his military training. Working quickly but methodically, Marcus began analyzing Harold's numerical records for patterns that might indicate the safe's combination. The old man's business documents contained numerous sequences of numbers that could potentially represent encoded information, including invoice numbers, inventory codes, and customer account references. The challenge was identifying which sequences were meaningful and determining the specific encoding method Harold had used to conceal the combination. Tank had moved to a position that would allow him to monitor both potential access points while remaining in communication with Marcus through subtle body language and positioning cues they had developed during their military service. The dog's behavior indicated that he was prepared to provide covering fire if Marcus could successfully open the safe and retrieve its contents, but that he was also ready to fight to the death if necessary to protect his partner. The breakthrough in decoding Harold's records came when Marcus recognized that certain invoice numbers corresponded to dates that were significant in Harold's personal life, including birthdays of family members and anniversaries of important business events. The pattern suggested that Harold had used a substitution system based on personal information that would be meaningful to him but obscure to anyone else. The specific combination appeared to be hidden within a series of inventory codes that corresponded to items that had never actually existed in the shop's physical inventory. As Marcus began attempting to input the decoded combination, the assault team's new access point finally opened with a grinding sound of metal and concrete being forcibly separated. The opening was small but sufficient to allow armed personnel to enter the basement while avoiding the defensive positions Marcus and Tank had established near the main staircase. The tactical situation had become a race between Marcus's efforts to open the safe and the assault team's efforts to neutralize him before he could access its contents. The safe's combination mechanism required precise timing and positioning that was complicated by the stress of the ongoing assault. Marcus had to input a complex sequence of numbers while maintaining awareness of the tactical situation and preparing for potential combat. Tank's positioning and alertness provided essential early warning of the assault team's movements, but the dog couldn't provide direct assistance with the safe's technical requirements. When the combination mechanism finally clicked and the safe's door began to swing open, Marcus experienced a moment of profound revelation that would fundamentally alter his understanding of everything that had led to this confrontation. The safe's contents were not what he had expected based on Harold's files and Frank's warnings. Instead of stolen goods or criminal evidence, the safe contained something far more significant and dangerous. The interior of the safe was lined with protective material and contained a single item that had been carefully preserved and documented. It was a thick manila folder containing what appeared to be original government documents, including photographs, technical specifications, and correspondence that bore official seals and classification markings. The documents were clearly related to military or intelligence operations, and their presence in a civilian location suggested that Harold had been involved in activities that went far beyond simple criminal enterprises. Marcus's rapid examination of the documents revealed that they contained evidence of a covert operation that had been conducted during the 1980s, involving the sale of advanced military equipment to foreign governments that were supposedly allied with the United States but had actually been transferring the technology to hostile nations. The operation had generated enormous profits for the individuals involved, but had also compromised American national security in ways that could have resulted in treason charges if the activities had been discovered. The photographs in the file showed Harold Brennan meeting with individuals who were identified as foreign intelligence operatives and arms dealers, along with several people who appeared to be American military or intelligence officials. The technical specifications related to advanced weapon systems and electronic warfare equipment that would have been extremely valuable to America's enemies during the Cold War period. The correspondence included communications between Harold and high-ranking government officials discussing payment schedules and delivery arrangements. Most damaging of all were documents that appeared to implicate current political and military leaders in the illegal operation, individuals who had built their careers on reputations for patriotism and national security expertise. If these documents were authentic, their public disclosure could destroy numerous careers and potentially destabilize important government institutions. The people who were currently assaulting Marcus's building were likely acting on behalf of individuals who would do anything to prevent these documents from becoming public knowledge. Tank's sudden bark indicated that the assault team had completed their entry preparations and were about to begin the final phase of their operation. Marcus realized that he now possessed information that was literally worth killing for, and that his possession of these documents had transformed him from an innocent bystander into a primary target for elimination. The tactical situation had evolved beyond a simple recovery operation into a matter of national security that would justify almost any level of violence to resolve. The assault began with the deployment of what appeared to be a flashbang grenade designed to disorient and disable anyone in the basement through overwhelming light and sound. Marcus had experienced similar devices during his military training and was able to protect himself partially by closing his eyes and covering his ears, but the effect was still devastating in the confined space. Tank was less prepared for the assault and was temporarily stunned by the intense sensory overload. In the chaos that followed the grenade's detonation, multiple armed figures entered the basement from both access points simultaneously. Their coordination and equipment indicated that they were prepared for sustained combat and were not concerned about minimizing casualties or property damage. Marcus realized that these were not capture and interrogate specialists but elimination experts whose primary objective was to recover the documents and eliminate anyone who had access to their contents. Marcus's military training took over as he used the documents as a shield while attempting to reach a defensive position that would provide some protection from the multiple attack vectors. Tank, despite being stunned by the flashbang grenade, was still attempting to fulfill his protective role and was engaging the attackers with the kind of controlled aggression that had made him valuable in combat situations. The dog's actions were buying precious seconds that might allow Marcus to escape or establish a more defensible position. The assault team's primary mistake was their assumption that Marcus was simply a civilian who had stumbled into a situation beyond his understanding and capabilities. Their tactics were designed for overwhelming an untrained target, not for engaging a veteran with extensive combat experience and a military working dog partner. This miscalculation provided Marcus with opportunities to exploit their overconfidence and potentially turn the tactical situation to his advantage. Using the basement's support pillars and storage areas for cover, Marcus was able to avoid the initial concentrated fire and begin implementing counterattack strategies that drew on his special operations training. The confined space that had seemed disadvantageous now worked in his favor by limiting the assault team's ability to use their numerical superiority effectively. Each engagement became a one-on-one confrontation that allowed Marcus's superior individual skills to compensate for being outnumbered. Tank's recovery from the flashbang effects was remarkably rapid, and the dog quickly resumed his protective role with what appeared to be enhanced aggression, motivated by the assault on his partner. The combination of Marcus's tactical expertise and Tank's combat training created a defensive capability that the assault team had not anticipated and were not prepared to counter effectively. The professional mercenaries found themselves engaged in exactly the kind of close-quarters combat that favored defenders with intimate knowledge of the terrain. The documents that Marcus had recovered from the safe were now the focal point of a life-or-death struggle that would determine not only his survival but potentially the fate of numerous powerful individuals whose careers and freedom depended on keeping these secrets buried. As the firefight intensified in the basement of the old pawn shop, Marcus realized that he had unknowingly inherited a legacy of betrayal and corruption that reached into the highest levels of American government and military leadership. The battle for Harold Brennan's final secret had begun in earnest, and Marcus Holloway was fighting not just for his life but for the right to expose a conspiracy that had been hidden for decades. The safe had indeed contained devastating secrets, but now those secrets belonged to a veteran who understood both the value of truth and the cost of silence in ways that Harold Brennan never could have imagined. The firefight in the basement lasted less than 10 minutes, but those minutes contained enough violence and chaos to fill a lifetime of nightmares. Marcus found himself operating on pure instinct, his body moving through tactical maneuvers that had been drilled into him during years of military training. Tank fought with the controlled ferocity of a warrior bred for battle, each attack precisely calculated to disable rather than kill, but devastating in its effectiveness nonetheless. When the shooting finally stopped, 3 of the assault team members lay unconscious or incapacitated on the concrete floor, their expensive equipment scattered around them like the debris of a failed military operation. The remaining attackers had retreated to regroup and reassess their strategy, leaving Marcus and Tank in temporary control of the basement and its precious contents. The government documents were still clutched in Marcus's hand, slightly damaged by gunfire but largely intact. The silence that followed the gunfight was more unsettling than the chaos that had preceded it. Marcus knew that his tactical victory was temporary at best, and that the people outside would soon implement more aggressive measures to recover the documents. The fact that they had been willing to engage in open warfare in an urban environment suggested that the stakes involved were enormous, and that they would escalate their methods until they achieved their objective or eliminated all witnesses to their activities. Tank had suffered minor injuries during the confrontation, including a graze along his left flank that was bleeding but not life-threatening. The dog's breathing was labored but steady, and his eyes remained alert and focused on potential threats. Marcus used supplies from Harold's first aid kit to clean and bandage the wound, all while maintaining awareness of the tactical situation and preparing for the next phase of the assault. The captured assault team members were all unconscious or too injured to provide immediate intelligence about their organization or objectives. Their equipment, however, told a compelling story about the resources and capabilities of the people who had sent them. The weapons were military-grade and recently manufactured. The communications equipment was sophisticated enough to coordinate complex operations across multiple locations, and their tactical gear bore markings that suggested connections to international security contractors with government ties. Most revealing was a tablet computer that had survived the firefight and contained operational briefings related to the assault on Marcus's building. The documents on the device confirmed that the attack was part of a larger operation designed to recover what was described as classified materials that had been stolen from government archives decades earlier. The briefings identified Harold Brennan as a former intelligence asset who had been terminated for unreliability and who had retained possession of sensitive documents despite official efforts to recover them. The operational files also contained background information on Marcus himself, including details about his military service record, his financial situation, and even his relationship with Tank. The thoroughness of their intelligence gathering suggested that his purchase of the pawn shop had been monitored from the beginning, and that the current assault had been planned for weeks or possibly months. The people behind this operation had resources that rivaled those of major government agencies. More disturbing were references to other individuals who had apparently been eliminated during previous recovery operations related to the same classified documents. Harold Brennan was not the only former intelligence asset who had retained possession of sensitive materials, and the current operation was part of a systematic effort to locate and recover all outstanding documents before they could be disclosed to unauthorized parties. Marcus realized that he had become part of a cleanup operation that had already claimed multiple lives. The tablet's communication logs showed that the assault team had been receiving real-time guidance from a command center that was monitoring the operation through satellite surveillance and electronic intelligence gathering. The people directing this operation had access to resources that suggested either government authorization or connections so deep within the intelligence community that the distinction was meaningless. Marcus was facing opponents who could mobilize military-grade assets against civilian targets with apparent impunity. Tank's sudden alertness to sounds from outside the building indicated that the next phase of the assault was beginning. The dog's positioning suggested that the attackers were implementing a different approach, possibly involving additional personnel or more aggressive tactics. Marcus realized that his defensive position in the basement, while temporarily successful, would become untenable if the attackers decided to use explosives or other area-effect weapons to eliminate him and the documents simultaneously. The decision to attempt an escape rather than continuing to defend a fixed position was based on Marcus's assessment that the attacker's resources would ultimately overwhelm any static defense he could mount. The basement had served its purpose by allowing him to survive the initial assault and recover the documents, but staying there would only delay the inevitable. He needed to find a way to get the documents to someone who could ensure their contents became public knowledge before he was eliminated. Using Tank's superior senses to guide their movement, Marcus began exploring the basement for alternative exit routes that might have escaped the attacker's surveillance. The building's age and construction meant that it shared utility connections with adjacent structures, and Harold's paranoid security preparations might have included escape routes that weren't visible in the building's official plans. The old pawnshop owner had clearly anticipated exactly this kind of situation and had prepared accordingly. Behind a stack of boxes that appeared to have been positioned to conceal it, Marcus discovered what looked like a maintenance access panel that had been modified with additional security hardware. The panel was larger than necessary for typical utility work and was secured with locks that matched those used on Harold's safe. The discovery suggested that Harold had created a secondary escape route that connected to the building's utility systems or adjacent structures. The modified access panel opened to reveal a narrow tunnel that had been excavated beneath the building's foundation and lined with concrete to prevent collapse. The tunnel was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, but it appeared to extend beyond the immediate area of the building toward what might be connections with the city's storm drain system or utility infrastructure. Harold had essentially created a private subway that would allow him to escape undetected if his building came under assault. Tank's reluctance to enter the tunnel was understandable given his size and the confined space, but Marcus realized that leaving the dog behind was not an option. The attackers would almost certainly kill Tank both to eliminate a witness and to prevent him from being used to track their escape route. The dog's military training included experience with confined spaces and underground movement, and Marcus trusted Tank's ability to navigate the tunnel despite the physical challenges. The escape through Harold's tunnel system was a claustrophobic nightmare that tested both Marcus's and Tank's endurance and determination. The tunnel was partially flooded with stagnant water that smelled of decades of accumulated debris, and the walls were lined with pipes and cables that created additional obstacles. Progress was measured in inches rather than feet, and the constant threat of discovery added psychological pressure to the physical demands of the escape. The tunnel eventually connected to a larger drainage system that provided access to the city's underground infrastructure. Marcus emerged from Harold's private escape route into a storm drain that ran beneath the commercial district, providing him with options for reaching different parts of the city without being tracked by the surveillance systems that were monitoring the surface streets. The government documents had survived the underground journey, protected by the waterproof folder that Harold had used to store them in the safe. Tank's emergence from the tunnel system was complicated by his injuries and the physical demands of the escape route, but the dog's determination to stay with Marcus overcame the obstacles. Once they reached the larger drainage system, Tank's mobility improved significantly, and he was able to resume his protective role despite his wounds. The dog's loyalty and courage during the escape had probably saved both their lives by ensuring that Marcus didn't have to navigate the dangerous underground route alone.
The storm drain system provided temporary shelter, while Marcus assessed his options for getting the government documents to someone who could ensure their contents became public knowledge. The documents were clearly authentic and contained information that could destroy the careers and freedom of numerous powerful individuals, but their value depended on reaching someone with the resources and credibility to verify their authenticity and publicize their contents effectively. Detective Sarah Chen seemed like the most logical choice for initial contact, but Marcus wasn't certain that local law enforcement had sufficient resources to protect the documents or investigate their contents properly. The people who had attacked his building had demonstrated access to military-grade equipment and intelligence capabilities that might exceed those of city police departments. Chen might be honest and competent, but she might also be overwhelmed by the scope and complexity of the conspiracy the documents revealed. Marcus's military experience had taught him the importance of secure communications when dealing with sensitive information, and he realized that his cell phone was almost certainly compromised by the surveillance systems that had been monitoring his activities. Any attempt to contact outside assistance using conventional communication methods would likely be intercepted and could lead the attackers directly to his location. He needed to find alternative methods of communication that would allow him to reach trustworthy contacts without exposing his position. The solution came from an unexpected source. Tank's behavior indicated that he was detecting familiar scents or sounds that suggested they were near a location the dog recognized from their previous activities in the city. Following Tank's lead through the drainage system, Marcus discovered that they had reached a position beneath the Veterans Center where he had originally found Tank 2 years earlier. The facility's proximity provided opportunities for secure communication and potential assistance from people who understood the challenges faced by veterans dealing with dangerous situations. The Veterans Center operated a 24-hour crisis hotline that was staffed by trained counselors who had experience dealing with former military personnel facing various types of emergencies. More importantly, the center's director was a retired colonel who maintained contacts throughout the military and intelligence communities and would understand the significance of the documents Marcus had recovered. The center also had security protocols designed to protect veterans who were dealing with threats from criminal organizations or hostile foreign agents. Accessing the Veterans Center through the storm drain system required navigating several additional tunnel connections and climbing through utility access points that tested Marcus's physical endurance and Tank's ability to follow complex routes.
The underground journey had become an extended tactical movement that required all of Marcus's navigation skills and Tank's sensory capabilities to complete successfully. The constant threat of discovery by the surveillance team searching for them added psychological pressure to the physical demands of the escape. When Marcus finally emerged from the underground system into the Veterans Center's basement, he was met by security personnel who initially treated him as a potential intruder before recognizing him as a client who had received services there in the past. Tank's presence helped establish Marcus's identity, since the dog was well known to staff members who had worked with both of them during Marcus's transition to civilian life. The center's security protocols included procedures for protecting veterans who were facing threats from various sources. The center's director, Colonel James Morrison, was awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning to deal with what the security staff initially described as a psychiatric emergency involving a veteran who was claiming to be pursued by government agents. Morrison's assessment of the situation changed dramatically when Marcus showed him the documents from Harold's safe and explained the circumstances that had led to his possession of them. The colonel's military intelligence background allowed him to immediately recognize the significance and authenticity of the materials. Morrison's examination of the documents revealed that they contained evidence of a conspiracy that had involved some of the most senior military and political leaders of the 1980s, individuals who had used their positions to facilitate illegal arms sales that had compromised national security for personal profit. The scope of the corruption was staggering, involving not just individual criminal acts but systematic betrayal of the public trust by people who had sworn oaths to protect American interests. The documents were potentially explosive enough to trigger congressional investigations and criminal prosecutions that could reach into the highest levels of government. The colonel's assessment of Marcus's tactical situation was equally sobering. The resources that had been deployed against him suggested that the people behind the cover-up had access to capabilities that rivaled those of major intelligence agencies and that they were willing to use lethal force to protect their secrets. Marcus was not dealing with ordinary criminals, but with a shadow organization that had been operating within the government for decades, using official resources to eliminate threats to their interests. Morrison's solution was to implement a strategy that would simultaneously protect Marcus and ensure that the documents reached people who could investigate their contents properly. Rather than trying to hide from the surveillance systems that were tracking him, Marcus would surrender himself to federal authorities while ensuring that copies of the documents were distributed to multiple independent investigators who could verify their authenticity and publicize their contents. The strategy was risky, but it offered the best chance of both survival and justice. The Veterans Center had secure communication capabilities that allowed Morrison to contact federal law enforcement agencies without alerting the surveillance systems that were monitoring conventional communication channels. Within hours, arrangements had been made for Marcus to surrender to FBI agents who specialized in investigating corruption within intelligence agencies and who had sufficient security clearances to handle the sensitive materials he possessed. Tank's role in the final resolution was as crucial as it had been throughout the crisis. The dog's presence provided both emotional support for Marcus and practical assistance in verifying his identity and credibility to federal investigators who needed to distinguish between legitimate whistleblowers and potentially unstable individuals making false claims. Tank's military service record and his partnership with Marcus provided independent confirmation of their reliability and competence. The FBI's investigation of the documents ultimately confirmed that they were authentic and contained evidence of criminal activities that warranted prosecution, despite the passage of time since the original crimes were committed. Several individuals who were still alive and had built prominent careers on their reputations for public service were arrested and charged with treason, conspiracy, and other serious crimes. The investigation also revealed that Harold Brennan had been murdered, not by natural causes, but by agents working for the conspiracy he had betrayed by retaining the documents. The mercenaries who had attacked Marcus's pawn shop were arrested during raids that were coordinated internationally with law enforcement agencies in multiple countries. Their organization was revealed to be a private security contractor that had been serving as the enforcement arm of the conspiracy, eliminating witnesses and recovering evidence that could expose their clients' criminal activities. The company's government contracts were immediately terminated, and its executives were charged with multiple counts of murder and conspiracy. Marcus's cooperation with federal investigators was rewarded with placement in a witness protection program that provided him with a new identity and relocation to a secure location where he could rebuild his life without fear of retaliation from surviving members of the conspiracy. Tank was included in the protection arrangements, ensuring that the partnership that had saved both their lives would continue in their new circumstances. The pawn shop building was eventually sold to a community development organization that converted it into a memorial honoring victims of government corruption and the whistleblowers who had exposed criminal activities within official institutions. Harold Brennan's name was included among those honored, acknowledging his ultimate decision to preserve evidence of wrongdoing despite the personal risks involved. The memorial served as a reminder that individual courage could still challenge institutional corruption even when the odds seemed impossible. Marcus established a new business in his secure location, operating under his protected identity while maintaining the skills and values that had guided him through his military service and civilian transition. Tank remained his constant companion, their bond strengthened by the crisis they had survived together. The experience had taught Marcus that his search for a quiet, peaceful life might not be possible in a world where corruption and injustice existed, but that he could still find meaning and purpose in standing up for truth when circumstances demanded action. The government documents that had nearly cost Marcus his life ultimately served their intended purpose by exposing a conspiracy that had operated in secret for decades. The public disclosure of the evidence led to significant reforms in oversight of intelligence agencies and military contractors, ensuring that similar corruption would be more difficult to conceal in the future. Harold Brennan's decision to preserve the documents, despite the personal cost, had finally achieved the justice he had sought through years of fearful silence. The crisis had transformed Marcus from a struggling veteran seeking solitude into a reluctant hero who had helped expose one of the most significant government scandals in American history. His military training had prepared him for combat, but his civilian experience had taught him the importance of moral courage in situations where violence alone could not provide solutions. The combination of tactical skills and ethical principles had allowed him to survive a situation that had claimed numerous other victims over the decades. Tank's role in the adventure had demonstrated that the bonds forged in military service could transcend the battlefield and provide strength in civilian challenges that were equally dangerous and demanding. The dog's loyalty, intelligence, and courage had been essential to Marcus's survival and success, proving that some partnerships were strong enough to overcome any obstacle. Their shared experience had reinforced the trust and mutual dependence that made them more effective together than either could have been alone. The story of the veteran who bought a closed pawn shop and discovered devastating secrets became a symbol of how ordinary citizens could still challenge powerful corruption when they possessed the courage to act on their convictions. Marcus Holloway's name joined the ranks of whistleblowers who had risked everything to expose wrongdoing, demonstrating that individual integrity remained a powerful force for justice even in an age of sophisticated surveillance and institutional cynicism. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.